All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. We're so glad you're here. Thank you so much for joining us for this whole virtual conference. As a reminder, these sessions are being recorded, and so they will be available on our website later this month, and I will be sending out an email to all registrants when that happens. This has been a fantastic conference. I've been so inspired by all of our presenters. Thank you so much to all of our speakers and presenters and attendees, all of the staff that has made this happen, and our sponsors who have supported us. You are now joining the session entitled Seed Rematriation, Creating Cross-Cultural Partnerships. This is our final keynote presentation of our 41st Annual Seed Savers Exchange Conference. My name is Janine Shepard. I am the Education and Engagement Manager here at Seed Savers Exchange, and I am really excited for this final keynote. I'm here with our friend and Seed Savers Exchange Board Chair, Rowen White. Rowen is a seed keeper, farmer, and educator. She is from the Mohawk community of Akwesasne, and she curates an extensive collection of Northeast native seeds. Rowen is not only the Seed Savers Exchange Board Chair, she is also co-founder of the Sierra Seeds Cooperative and founder of the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, an initiative of the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance. In 2017, Rowen approached Seed Savers about participating in the ISKN Rematriation program. It's been an honor for us to participate in this program, and it really opened the door to Seed Savers Exchange to re-examine how we look at the seeds in our care and to think about what we can do to get these seeds into the hands of their people. As Rowen is giving this presentation, feel free to type any questions you have in the chat, and we'll get to as many questions as we can after the presentation. Rowen, thank you so much for being with us here today. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Great, my pleasure. Lovely to see everyone today. Sego Seaguego, Ganyet Nahawa Yungyats. I just introduced myself in my Mohawk language, just letting you know that I'm here. My Mohawk name is Ganyet Nahawa, and that means she carries the snow. I was born into a swirling blizzard 41 years ago. But I'm just gonna allow us to bask in the beauty of this picture for a minute. And I'm going to call us in and ground us in with just a short piece, a prose piece that I wrote, just to kind of give us the essence of sort of what we're gonna be talking about today in this grand topic of seed rematriation. And so I wrote a piece called They Tried to Bury Us. And so just from wherever you are, whatever you've been doing today, running around or engaging in all the amazing workshops, I just want you to settle into your seat, find your center, find that taproot that goes deep into the earth, and also imagine whoever you are in this circle of learning today. Each and every one of you behind you has a beautiful array of ancestors who had deep connection to land and to seeds and to language and to culture from someplace on this beautiful earth. And so I just want you to also imagine that they're also kind of in a concentric circle in our here with us today. So it was once said, they tried to bury us, but they did not know we were seeds. All of the generations of people who came before us, who in their own ways prayed for the sprouting of our deeply connected lifeways once again. I return with my beautiful children in hand to the traditional earth-based traditions of our people, the first in many generations of my bloodlines to follow the sacred ceremonial calendar, renewing time-honored relationships with all around us, eating our traditional foods and caring for their seeds. Those ancestors, they prayed for us in many ways, in diverse tongues and in small, humble, everyday ceremonies of patting babies to sleep or stirring the cooking pot and sitting in the shade of a beautiful oak tree to make a basket, rowing such baskets across mighty rivers to market. In the songs that honored the births and the deaths, the planting and the harvests. These prayers of our ancestors, in their own special ways, sowed seeds of resilience and vitality that they knew would take generations of laying dormant in the dark soils of our hearts, carried down through the blood memory in the rivers of our mother's sweet womb water that is held in our spines, our veins, and in our marrow. 7 generations or more, these seeds of prayer were tucked into the safety of the soil of the underground mycelia of cultural and ancestral memory, tucked deep into the earth that is our own bodies, connected through tributaries of rivers, of bloodlines. These seeds are finally sprouting in their own time. The seeds enduring the scarification and weathering of decades of struggles and challenges, and also the spirit fire of our mothers and grandmothers' tenacity for ensuring that our lifeways would stay alive amidst the confusion. What they endured so that we could be here alive today, tending these shiny-faced green sprouts of life that they so diligently tucked into the safety of dark soils, hidden from hungry and greedy hands until generations later, they could emerge with renewed vigor and vitality. It was such scarification that has given the prayers the courage to sprout into our lives. We are their wildest dreams, sprouting and coming to life. They tried to bury us, but they did not know we were seeds. And that's what I think of when I look at this beautiful picture of these gorgeous women here. And I'm going to tell the story of this picture here, but we'll begin to just move forward and just begin to set the context. So today I've been asked to sort of begin the conversation about seed rematriation, knowing that Seed Savers is going to continue to invite voices from the movement and voices from this collaboration. But I have the honor and privilege of being able to come here today and share a little bit about, I think, one of the most impactful parts of the food sovereignty movement that I have been a part of in the last 25 years. I've been on the seed path since I was 17. I came to the seed path really in a diaspora of disconnection from my Indigenous cultural traditions. My family had been deeply impacted by boarding schools, acculturation, assimilation, all of those things. And my great-grandparents were farmers and my grandparents grew up on farms, but that was a disconnection. And so I came to seeds as a way to find my way home. And now that I can look back in sort of a way of rematriating myself back to my own Mohawk culture. And so today we're just going to talk a little bit into this idea of seed rematriation. And in the seed movement, we have begun to use this word rematriation as it relates to bringing seeds home again. In many communities, including my own Mohawk tradition, the responsibility of caring for the seeds over the generations is ultimately within the women's realm. Both men and women, we farm and plant seeds, but their care and stewardship are part of our women's bundle of responsibility. And I've been thinking a lot about the word responsibility because my elders always say, with privilege comes responsibility, and it's a real honor and privilege to be one of many who carries a seed bundle again. And I love to think about the word responsibility as the ability to respond, right? Like when you break it down into its core or into its essence. And so many of us have the ability to respond to the call of the times, which is the seeds are asking to be remembered again and to be loved again and cared for again. So this word rematriation reflects the restoration of the feminine seeds, the life-giving seeds, the ovaries, the wombs of the plant, back into communities of origin again. And the indigenous concept of rematriation also refers to reclaiming of ancestral remains, of spirituality, of culture, of knowledge, of resources, instead of the more patriarchal associated word repatriation. It simply means back to Mother Earth, a return to our origins, to life and co-creation, rather than this very imperialist destruction and colonization. This is a reclamation of germination and of the life-giving force of the divine feminine. So, you know, there's many ways, and in the end of this, I hope we'll all engage the chat a little. I have some questions for you, as well as opening up the chat for questions for me. But one of the quotes here are one of the definitions that has helped us to speak about rematriation is that seed rematriation encompasses the idea of returning ancestral land races or seeds back to Mother Earth or communities of origin for in situ conservation, meaning in community, in context, in life, rather than after decades of ex situ preservation in gene banks. The seeds return to their motherland, matria, where they will be nourished and protected. So as we know, many of you are seed keepers and have bundles of your own seeds that you've tended and stewarded, or perhaps you are just beginning on the path of seed keeper. But for a multitude of reasons, many seeds have moved from their land of origin, from tribal communities outward. And for those of us who are in relationship to seed, we know that seeds move and migrate, right? Like, you know, they have all of these beautiful evolutionary ways of attaching themselves to fur or, you know, spiraling themselves out with these mechanisms of dispersal. And it's a natural part of the seed's journey to want to move along kinship routes and trade routes. Corn herself moved from the very fertile valley of Oaxaca to all regions of the globe through trade and kinship routes. But again, as I spoke to before in my own family bloodlines, the same is true for our collective as Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island or North America, which is that there's been this period of time of immense pressures of colonization and displacement, resulting in acculturation and assimilation in North America. And I always like to remind folks that we actually, as Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island, we live in a post-apocalyptic reality. We've already been through a wave of apocalypse where our whole way of living in balance and in relationship to the land was deeply disrupted. And so there have been, through a number of different reasons, there have been disconnections between people and their seeds. I know for my own people, there were instances of during the Revolutionary War when George Washington sent General Sullivan into New York to burn, you know, thousands upon thousands of acres of cornfields to basically disempower the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And, you know, amidst all odds, you know, through, you know, adversities and immensities like that, as well as walking on the Trail of Tears or, you know, the numerous displacements, sometimes we carried those seed bundles with us, right? Sometimes against all odds, we had foresighted elders who are now ancestors who kept those seeds alive, knowing that wherever we were going or however we moved on the land, that those seeds were a responsibility and that we had, that they were inextricably intertwined into our lives, into our cosmologies and cosmovisions. But sometimes those seeds did not make it, and sometimes those seeds were, even in more benign circumstances, traded out to neighbors and to people, to settlers and merchants. And unfortunately, sometimes those seeds did not stay alive or stay stewarded or tended in the communities of origin, largely because of the disruptions and the ways in which Indigenous peoples of North America have been severed from the land and have been displaced and have endured an incredible amount of land loss. But some of these seeds, for reasons, unknown or maybe documented in these databases, have found themselves in places like the USDA Seed Bank, public access seed banks like Seed Savers Exchange, the Field Museum in Chicago, the University of Michigan, and many other places where they've landed. And so, again, for Native folks like myself, we're very familiar with this word repatriation, which is the return of treasures, ancestral remains, sacred objects. The displaced cultural property items are physical artifacts that were often taken by theft or violence from people of origin, again, usually in an act of theft or imperialism, colonialism, or war. And so the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act describes the rights of our people that those funerary objects or there's ancestral remains or those culturally significant artifacts are indeed our cultural inheritance, and that we have a birthright too. And so there has been some legislation around the protection of those rights and the return of those particular meaningful parts of our culture. And but now we come to this time when we have been discovering in many of these museums and seed banks and universities that not only are there ancestral remains and objects of great significance to us, but there are also seeds which are actually still, in many cases, are still living and still have the capacity to grow and to germinate and to be in our lives again. And so we have a really unique and beautiful and healing opportunity in this time to call those seeds home. And I'm going to tell some stories of resilience of the movement, of how healing and beautiful the seed rematriation work has been for many of us. Now, this is a framing of the word rematriation from one of my elders and mentors, Martin Prechtel. He writes about this in The Unlikely Piece of Cuchamaquik, which is an incredible book. And he says, rematriation is a term that describes an instance where land, air, water, animals, plants, ideas, and ways of doing things and living are purposefully returned to their original natural context, their mother, the great female holy wild. Like the repatriation of prisoners after years of war or millennia of unwilling slavery in service to an unconscious civilization, exploited and depleted for their wild vitality. Any attempt to rematriate them back to the holy in nature is the beginning of cultural sanity and healing. And we've seen this, and some of the stories that I'm going to tell you are going to be stories of resilience and be stories of intergenerational healing. Connections that seem almost miraculous and completely unexpected, but serve as this bridge of reparations and reconciliation and healing between groups of people who have historically perhaps been adversarial and have been creating patterns and perpetuating harm against one another. So, we ask the question as we get into this work, many of our Native communities, as we are moving towards dignified resurgence of our cultures, of our lifeways. What happens when we find seeds in museums or seed banks or universities? I'm gonna start to tell some stories about the way in which my people and many indigenous peoples across North America view and relate to seeds, and they are our living relatives. And so in many instances in the seed rematriation work, we have had to come up with new ceremonies that will help us to welcome these seeds home as they return again. And so I'm gonna share a little bit of some of the deep healing and significance of that work. So as I said before, there's been centuries of disruption, and we have so many different seeds. I mean, many of you are familiar with the USDA GRIN system. Myself and many other native seed keepers have been researching and looking into these institution seed banks, working with universities, partnering with museums, working with great people like the folks at Seed Savers Exchange to begin to understand where are some of the seeds that are culturally significant to us, and to begin this beautiful and oftentimes very complex and complicated process of beginning to welcome them home back into a living context. And again, another quote from Martine, he says, "It's not enough to just save heritage seeds," right? The culture of these people to whom each seed belongs to must be kept alive along with seeds and their cultivation, not in freezers or museums, but in their own soil and in our daily lives, right? And so that's this work that we're doing with seed rematriation, is that it's participatory conservation or rest. I like to use the word seed restoration because I feel like conservation also still really appeals to the sort of museum kind of curating this sort of snapshot of what was, as opposed to recognizing that there's this very dynamic relationships that seeds have to land, but also that seeds have to humans, that we've been bound in this beautifully reciprocal relationship since the dawning of agriculture. And many of our cultures have evolved, co-evolved in conjunction with these beautiful seed and food plants. And as I spoke before, there's this concept of in situ conservation or in situ seed restoration, which is making sure that the only way that seeds are going to survive for the long term and that we're going to have them from season to season is if their cultural context is preserved, right? That we as humans are able to continue to engage in the evolutionary services as farmers and gardeners in partnership with seeds and with the land. But we've come to a time, again, many of you know the history of, the incredible decline and erosion of genetic diversity globally, but also in North America. And Seed Savers Exchange was founded to basically combat that problem, or to be a solution in the face of that problem. And countless generations of Indigenous seed keepers have also been enclaves of biodiversity, agricultural biodiversity, inside of culturally encoded lifeways that understood that these seeds were vital to our health and well-being. And so when we look at the way in which we move forward in seed sovereignty, or some people call it seed security, but I like the term seed resilience because I feel like it is a more alive term. But there's this idea of what does it mean to be a seed resilient community, right? Or a seed secure, seed sovereign community. And it's not that these seeds are tucked away into these gene banks and for some great unknown future, but that we're in relationship with them in our everyday lives, and that we have a culture, we have a cultural container where we can, where our children and our elders and the intergenerational community recognizes the value of diversity and recognizes our interdependence to these seeds. And so that's part of this work of seed rematriation and the seed sovereignty work in Indigenous communities. It's not just about making sure that we have the seeds, but it's making sure that we are creating the conditions for people to thrive. For it's like the reseeding of the people. It's like for people to be able to thrive in their knowledge of how to be in relationship with seeds and food. And so that's been my life's work, and will continue to be the work that I am forever inspired by. Because as Indigenous peoples, we are lineal descendants of our traditional foods. So we have creation stories and cosmological stories that we are told through our ceremonies and in our cultural gatherings, and in our from our culture bearers down to the young people. that remind us that we are literally related to our food. In our creation story, we know this is a beautiful artistic rendition of this turtle island that we know of, that Sky Woman, and then eventually she birthed her original daughter onto this place that we know of as Turtle Island. And part of this work is restoring relationships and agreements to this cosmogenealogy of our indigenous seeds. We have these beautiful stories of Sky Woman, original woman, coming down to this place from the sky world onto the back of a turtle, and birthing a daughter who then eventually births twins. And when she's in birth, she passed away in childbirth, but in her sort of dying breaths, she said, "From my body will sprout the foods and seeds that will sustain us." And from her hands came the beans, and from her breasts came the corn, and from her belly button came the squash vines, and from her legs sprouted the potatoes and sunflowers, and from her heart grew the strawberries, and from her head grew the sacred tobacco, right? And so from her body, our ancestors were sustained. And so those foods are literally our ancestors, right? And so their place in our cosmovision and our understanding of who we are is interwoven into our DNA. It's interwoven into our cellular memory and who we are. And so it's not as though we treat the seeds like they're our mother. They literally are our grandmothers, right? They literally are our relatives. And that our elders, who are now ancestors, knew that those seeds played a significant role. And so as we engage in this food sovereignty work and move towards dignified resurgence, we recognize that seeds and foods are an inextricable part of this cultural revitalization. The way in which and this is across the globe, any culture that you come from, the way in which we nourish ourselves or clothe ourselves or shelter ourselves is the wellspring of culture, right? So it's from these seeds and foods that is the germination of culture and continues. So you'll see that our ceremonies are guided by the agricultural cycles, right? Our story, there's so many stories that are woven into this beautiful kind of phenology, or this beautiful cycle, these life cycles that relate to this. And so that's why I think it's such a compelling multi-sensory way of remembering who we are, is when we begin to eat these foods again and taste these foods again. And but many of us indigenous peoples are living in community where perhaps those seeds have been lost to us over the ages. And so hence we have this beautiful seed rematriation work to do. So I'm going to get into a little bit of storytelling and share some pretty incredible people here. This is an incredibly wonderful story that actually emerged. My weaving into it actually emerged at the Seed Savers Exchange conference a few years ago, when we actually had Hank Will, who is the descendant of Oscar Will and George Will, who had the Oscar Will Company, which was a seed company that really was out on the prairie during sort of westward expansion in North Dakota. And the Will family actually came into quite a relationship, and actually a mutually beneficial relationship, with the woman who's in the upper, I guess my upper right-hand corner of the screen, and her name is Scattered Corn. And Scattered Corn is a Hidatsa and Mandan corn priestess or seed keeper who is mentioned quite a bit in George Will's book called Corn Amongst the Indians of the Upper Missouri, which is an incredible ethnographic book. And so the Oscar Will Company specialized in all kinds of seeds that would do well in, in homesteads along in the Dakotas and in the prairies. And Scattered Corn befriended Oscar Will, and they did a lot of sharing of seed. And Scattered Corn's son was a man named Holding Eagle. And so many of the seeds that were documented in these old catalogs had a provenance from Scattered Corn's community. And Scattered Corn's community was, at that time in the late 1800s, there was a time of great upheaval, right? A lot of movement, land loss, again, the impacts of settler colonialism on the prairie and the plains and westward expansion had a high violent cost on Indigenous peoples. But again, against all odds, there was this friendship and this mutually beneficial relationship that emerged, and seeds were passed over. And eventually, many of these seeds ended up in collections in museums. In the early 1900s, there was this thing called salvage anthropology that was happening. Unfortunately, there were people who believed, because of the tools of the colonial tools, that Indigenous peoples were going to assimilate, because of the boarding schools and the assimilation agenda, that these cultures were going to disappear. But there was this fetishization of their culture. And so there were artifacts being gathered and things being gathered and ethnographic reports being written. And so a bunch of these seeds that were the three affiliated tribes, the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara people, ended up in places like the Minnesota Museum of Science, in the Field Museum, and in many other places, largely through the hands of Oscar H. Will and through the seed company. So you can see in the photo here, this is from the collection at the Minnesota Museum of Science. And the woman that you see in the lower right-hand corner is a woman named Jamie Holding Eagle, who is a dear friend and a part of our Indigenous Seed Keepers Network. And when I was at the keynote with Hank Will at the Seed Savers Exchange conference, he was talking about Scattered Corn and Holding Eagle and the role that these Indigenous peoples played in his own family lineage and connection with seed. And we were actually able to connect the descendant of Oscar H. Will, Hank Will, with the descendant of Scattered Corn, Jamie Holding Eagle. And we were able to bridge the connection and allow some of these seeds to return back home to the Holding Eagle family. And so this is a story of resilience. I mean, I just remember when I met Hank that day, and it was very touching and beautiful. And there's a lot more stories that will be birthed out of that. And so, as we look back to look at some of these old ethnographic, sort of, memories and, or, just the scribes, like looking back into these books. These pictures were actually ones that guided me on my seed journey around 25 years ago. When I was 17, I was beginning to ask the question, who were the seeds that fed my ancestors? And I found this old book written by F.W. Waugh that was called Iroquois Foods and Food Preparation, that was written in the early 1900s. And so I had these pictures in front of me of these old seed relatives that had been documented and had been gathered by these old ethnographers, again, at the turn of the century. And it began to pique my interest. And so I printed some of these plates out and went home to my own home communities and began to ask around. And some of these seeds still existed in our community, like the white corn, the multicolored Hekua corn, but some of these seeds nobody had them anymore, right? And so we began to sort of engage in this sort of scavenger hunt, so to speak, to begin to sort of uncover where might we find these, because we know that they were gathering samples of these seeds at this time. So where did they end up? And so we've actually gone into the archives of the University of Ontario at Guelph and gathered a lot of the old books and archives from F.W. Waugh and have begun to connect back. So sometimes we need to look back at some of these old ethnographic records to see 100 years ago what seeds were being grown. And this allows us to be able to look forward and be able to say, where might those seeds reside? Who might have those seeds? Perhaps they got traded out, and begin to rematriate them back home and bring those relatives home. So this has inspired what I call a cross-cultural participatory seed conservation or restoration approach. As Janine had spoke about, I had approached Seed Savers Exchange since I had served on their board and have been a long-time listed member, knowing that, you know, many of the seeds inside of that collection had Indigenous origins, and perhaps some of those seeds were no longer in community or no longer in situ in those Indigenous communities. And how could we partner in this participatory model where institutions and seed banks could leverage their resources, you know, the seeds that they have, the resources, the financial resources, et cetera, to be able to bridge that and begin to build trust and build relationship again and build those healing relationships with Indigenous communities, and to begin to engage in, I think, a form of reparations is beginning to bring those seeds home in a good way. And in this approach of participatory restoration or conservation, it's not sort of the typical sort of, I don't know, like the Peace Corps, just like this sort of patronizing sort of white savior sort of way of going about it. But this participatory model actually centers Indigenous leadership, ecological knowledge, cultural memory, autonomy and sovereignty over our cultural inheritance of seeds. And so we've been working to create literacy in this work, creating protocols, educating our partners, our non-native partners, institutions, on how we as Indigenous peoples engage with our cultural inheritance of seed and how we speak about them and how we relate to them. You know, I remember in the beginning of this, it was like going into these spaces and, you know, I think naively, a lot of people who work in seed banks will oftentimes refer to seeds as accessions or as germplasm or as, you know, various other words. And, you know, for us, it was very off-putting as Indigenous peoples because those seeds aren't just accessions or germplasm. You know, they have whole universes of story, of cultural memory and relationship to us. And so there was this opportunity for us to begin to paint a picture of this cosmogenealogy and this cosmovision that we have as Indigenous peoples and begin to restore that tapestry of understanding to the partners that we were working with. And so we're so grateful to Seed Savers Exchange and the Field Museum and many other partners that have honored the centering of this Indigenous leadership in this work, because I think it's vital to really address those power dynamics and really looking at how, you know, and in some of the stories, and I'm going to tell a few other stories here, but, you know, when we were hearing about how this work began to impact large global gene banks like CIMMYT in Mexico, recognizing that there's a lot of gatekeeping that happens in institutions and seed banks. There's a lot of ways in which there are red tape and bureaucracies, which actually create barriers of access for Indigenous and village communities to actually access seeds that are their cultural inheritance and are their birthright, but are being held by these gene banks and institutions in ways that make them inaccessible. And so this seed rematriation work and creating protocols and building relationships of trust and creating literacy is beginning to break down some of that, those bureaucracies and that red tape, and begin to frame this model of participatory restoration, seed restoration, or seed conservation that centers Indigenous leadership, because it is our contributions over many, many generations that have led to the development of many of these seeds that have historic and cultural significance, but also have significance on the horizon for the way in which we continue to adapt to climate change, and recognizing that we don't have a proprietary relationship to seeds, but we have a collective relational and kin-centric relationship to seeds. And so just doing the work. It's been a lot of work to work with non-native entities, but it's been, I think, very fruitful, and we have lots of growing edges there. But this seed rematriation work is the fertile beginning of the reseeding of the people. I just love this photo. I just want us all to take a moment to look at this photo and look at the joy in those children's faces and imagine that we can come back to a place of accessing that ancestral brilliance of that intergenerational connection and knowledge, and that will help us return to this cultural sanity and vibrant lifeways again. And that's the prayer that's encoded inside of this work. That's what we're aiming for, is to be in relationship and vibrant relationship with our seeds again, that the children would know the flavors of that beautiful corn and know the songs to sing to the corn and know how to plant the corn, right? Like that's the prayer behind this movement. And so this picture it touches me every time. And so as our entity, Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, in our listening sessions, because we're very community led, we lead by community, in our efforts to support communities in their seed sovereignty efforts, our biggest request oftentimes is access to culturally significant seeds. Like if people want to begin along the food sovereignty journey, we know that in agricultural food sovereignty, seeds are foundation. And so how can we create bridges of access to those old seeds that perhaps have been lost? And so we've been doing work with our communities around seed sovereignty assessments and seed census work. So going into community to do seed census work to really, it's a collective effort to tend the health of seed in our community and to really assess what the state of seed is in our community and begin to recognize where are the gaps, what are the seeds that we're still looking for, and then begin to work with institutions and seed banks, et cetera, to see if we can find those seeds once again. And the seeds are beginning to come home. And so I'm just going to share a few slides of just some hopeful stories of, Gagne's yellow eye, which is a Mohawk bean that has been with us for a long, long time, coming home. Navajo or Dene robin's egg corn that is being returned to the Four Corners region for the Dene people to plant those seeds once again. Beans like the Hidatsa red bean and many, many other seeds of these are beginning to find their way home in this way. And so Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, we partnered with Seed Savers Exchange in 2017 to formalize this partnership and began. I mean, I think many of us were sort of informally rematriating seeds through the yearbook or other places where we were finding them, but we approached Seed Savers Exchange in this collaborative partnership, which is continuing to grow. And I know that there may be future opportunities for Seed Savers Exchange to share the voices of some of those seed keepers. But in this partnership, this is Jessica Greendeer, and she relayed that she's incredibly grateful for the relationship between ISKN and Seed Savers Exchange because it helped me to reconnect with other parts of my culture. And that's what I think is so beautiful about the seed work. It's not just about growing seed. Anyone can put seed in the ground, but it's about cultivating the relationship and the whole history of that seed and why our ancestors did everything they could to protect them. So this work, it is kerneling. I always say it's kind of like kerneling, like seeds on a cob, rippling outwards and into many new partnerships and collaborations. And so I'm just going to quickly kind of give you a glimpse of some of the exciting ways in which this seed rematriation work that ISKN has been a thought leader and a proponent of is inspiring others, because this is the people's work. These are the, no one of us is in charge of this work. In fact, it's the seeds themselves wanting to come home, and it's the ancestors themselves, their prayer sprouting, as I had mentioned in that piece I wrote before. It's their desire to be back in our lives again. And so this is the people's work. And so the seeds have come to many of us, myself included, but many, many people around the circle, and have asked for us to respond, in this time to their needs. And the seed rematriation movement birthed from that, right? And it's really from this impetus of the seeds asking in that way. And so we've partnered with the Field Museum in Chicago and the Meskwaki community in Tama, Iowa. There's been a really fruitful and beautiful connection that has grown over the last few years. Many of these seeds were gathered by an anthropologist and ethnologist who was half Meskwaki himself back in the early 1900s, a man named William Jones. Had been put them there for safekeeping at a time of great cultural upheaval, and now those seeds are returning back to the Meskwaki people. This picture that we looked at before, this is Henrietta Gomez and the women from the Red Willow Farm at Taos Pueblo. This squash that they're cradling so intimately and beautifully is one that was grown at the Seed Savers Exchange farm and was shipped to the Taos Pueblo, where I helped facilitate a beautiful ceremony of rematriation in return. And I will tell you that I will never forget that day. It was so beautiful. There were so many beautiful words spoken. And so this is the image of rematriation, of the governor of the Taos Pueblo receiving those seeds from this cross-cultural collaboration and seed rematriation. And those seeds have beautifully returned home and continue to feed the people and fulfill their original agreements to those people. We've partnered through Seed Savers Exchange. We've connected with our Haudenosaunee communities, Iroquois communities in the Northeast, and have worked in partnership with many different people in a seed sanctuary garden, both in the Hudson Valley and also in my home community of Akwesasne, as well as some of the Haudenosaunee seeds that have been grown at Seed Savers Exchange have been distributed across the Six Nations communities in both New York, Canada, and Wisconsin. And so, you can see some of the seeds that were rematriated from Seed Savers Exchange were then grown in the Seed Sanctuary Garden. And this is literally the beginning of thousands and thousands of pounds of corn and beans and squash coming back home to feed the people at Akwesasne. And so I just know that, you can see the look on everybody's faces, the look of pride, the look of happiness, of satisfaction. And we know that when we engage in this work, that the seeds are healing us in this work, and they're helping us to move forward. This is a dear friend, Deb Echohawk, from the Pawnee Seed Preservation Project, and they've been deeply engaged in a land and seed rematriation project in collaboration with descendants of settlers in their ancestral homeland in Kearney, Nebraska. They were resettled over 150 years ago in Indian territory, which is Oklahoma, current day Oklahoma. But they, in the last 15 years, have reconnected with descendants of settlers in their ancestral homeland and have begun to rematriate seeds back to that land, and have worked in partnership to begin to find their way home as people, and then the seeds finding their way home as seeds to that original homeland. And so there's some beautiful things to learn from Deb and the work that they're doing there. This work that we've been doing at ISKN has inspired things on an international level, this idea of seed rematriation. And Denise Kostich, who's now a member of our board of directors at Seed Savers Exchange, says that the seed rematriation process allows our gene bank to build a more integrative, collaborative, and respectful partnership with landrace farmers and create a synergism between in situ and ex situ forms of genetic resource conservation. We view rematriation as a circular model for genetic resources in which an evolutionary conservation strategy in situ is coupled with a static conservation process ex situ, and that could potentially generate a cycle of germplasm exchange where conservation, use, and improvement are still happening and building on one another. So they're working with many different villages and farmers in all over Mexico. And one of the Gene Bank Platform Impact Fellows said that seeds that may serve a vital role in increasing the genetic variability and protecting the world's most important crops are being reawakened after hibernating for decades in gene banks. And we're starting to see some of these seeds find their way home. And so there's great articles written about this work and the way in which our work at ISKN and the partnership with Seed Savers Exchange inspired some significant changes or in participatory restoration and conservation at one of the big global gene banks, this one being CIMMYT in Oaxaca, Mexico. And so we have been distributing many of these seeds across Turtle Island. We ran a seed drive last year during COVID and distributed almost over 11,000 packets of seed, many of which were from some of the seed rematriation work that we've been doing in community. And what this is an intercultural collaboration. It's reseeding the culture of belonging in our foodways. This was a picture from our seed sanctuary garden where Mohawk farmers from Akwesasne were working in collaboration with people from many different cultural backgrounds. And this diverse culture of agriculture is moving us again towards the possibility of cultural sanity again in a time of great division, right? We're in this country, we're at a time, at a crossroads of divisiveness. And so there's a lot of hope in this work. And so in closing, I want to just give a little plug. We've been working on a short film called Seed Mother Coming Home, which is sort of giving the essence of the seed rematriation movement, along with a suite of resources. We have a seed rematriation action guide, as well as a suite of podcasts that we're releasing through the Native Seed Pod in collaboration with the Cultural Conservancy. And so we're actually having a short film viewing on next Friday, on July 23rd. And we are, hopefully you can make it. There's the link to register. You can find that also on my Instagram. I'll link that at the end. So we hope you can join us, but it'll be available on our YouTube and also on our social media accounts kind of for free. It's like a 7 or 8 minute video that will be filmed, that will be able to be accessed here into the future. And then go check out the Native Seed Pod, which is a wonderful podcast. They're going to be releasing a series of podcasts, which include Becky Webster, who's from Oneida, Jessica Greendeer from Ho-Chunk, and Shelley Buffalo from Meskwaki, who have been some of the key partners with the Seed Savers Exchange Seed Rematriation project. So go check that out. And you know, in closing, before we open it up for a few minutes of questions, I just wanted to sort of reinforce, or just kind of ground us back into this idea that as Indigenous peoples, we believe that we do not own the seeds, right? We don't have a proprietary relationship to seeds, but that we borrow them from our children. That's the idea, is that we are taking care of them on behalf of future generations. And so, you know, no matter who you are or who you descend from, you all descend from people who had beautifully storied and exquisite relationships with land and seed. I know that for a fact. There's not one single one of us who's listening today who doesn't descend from people who at one point had an intact understanding of the beautiful interdependence between us and food and our seeds. And so we all have some rematriating to do, right? Like we all have this work of rematriating ourselves back to some understanding of cultural sanity again. I know many of us live in a diaspora of disconnection. And so seeds, for me and for many of us, have been one pathway in which we begin to find our way home and engage in this bigger rematriation of ourselves, right? Back to our motherlands, back to an understanding of what it means to be human. And so hopefully some of these stories inspired you, and perhaps in this moment, in honor of that grand lineage of seed keepers who came before us, maybe in this moment, each and every one of us can take a deep breath and we can make a renewed commitment to be those responsible descendants and those good future ancestors who can carry a good, beautiful seed bundle for the nourishment of for those yet to come. And so I just want us to sort of sit in that and recognize that this isn't just some people doing this work, like Deb Echo Hawk and Becky Webster and Jess Greendew. They're amazing humans, but this is the people's work. This is everybody's work. This is work we all have to engage in, right? We have to make our ancestors proud that we weren't that generation. We were on that threshold of memory, and we were the ones who chose not to forget. That we chose to be the ones who would remember and who would perhaps open up our hands, and maybe we have a bundle that's looking pretty empty and we don't have a whole lot in it, but maybe we can fill that bundle of cultural inheritance with a few more things so that our children might have a little bit more beauty and a little bit more something to nourish themselves. And so in closing, you know, we as Indigenous peoples, we carry our nations with the same love that we carry our children. And we carry our seeds and our songs and our prayers and our original agreements. And it is our capacity to love fiercely and to defend what we feel most deeply connected to that will bring about the revolution of the world we know in our hearts is possible. And I think it's that relationality, or that love, that ability to relate to the earth or to seeds, that beyond any technology is what is going to sprout what's coming ahead. And so as we work to remember, as we work to pull together the threads of memory and story, the wisdom of our ancestors, we are reminded once again, care for the seeds as though they are your children. Care for the earth, for she is your mother. Make yourself into a vessel into which the wise voices of our ancestors can echo. And I want us to sit with that. It's really, really important that we recognize that it's our ability to relate to these seeds in this deeper way. That's the true sustainability of this work, because, like Wendell Berry says, we exploit what we merely value, but we defend what we love, right? And we all have the capacity to defend these seeds and to bring them home into loving arms. And so as you leave this session, I just want you to think about, what does seed rematriation or rematriation mean to you in your lineage, and you as people? And so I'll just leave that in closing with that question. And here's just a way to connect. We have a website at nativefoodalliance.org. I have my Instagram. I'm always preaching my seed gospel on my Instagram. So if you like that, come check me out. We have an Instagram on a Native Food Alliance, and there are many different ways that you can support. So I'm just so grateful that we had this time together. And I think Janine will just open it up for a little bit of questions before we close.
Thank you so much, Rowen. It's always so lovely to hear you speaking about this. We do have some questions already coming in. I just want to take a minute to remind everyone, if you have questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat here. You can also raise your hand and ask your question directly. In order to do that, there's a little icon at the bottom of your screen that says reaction. If you click on that, you'll have an option that says raise hand. If you do that, I will see that you have a question and I can call on you to ask it. So thank you again, Rowen.
And I'm going to go ahead and stop the screen share so maybe we can see everybody.
There we go. Great.
Okay, great.
Beautiful.
Easier for me to see this chat too.
Yeah. So we had a question coming in from Barb. Barb says, thank you for sharing your poetry and stories. Barb is wondering if you're also partnering with Indigenous chefs, people such as Chef Tanya Brandt and Sean Sherman.
Yeah.
Barb notes that the University of Minnesota has an annual conference focused on Indigenous nutrition and health that includes returning to cooking and growing traditional foods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question, Barb. So at Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance, one of our programs is the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, but we have a holistic approach, which is we have a food and culinary mentorship program. So we see sort of this holistic seed to table, right? Like that, we make these connections and create access to seed and restore relationships to seed. But of course, once you have the seed and you're planting it, then it's like, oh, like we have this beautiful harvest. Okay, now how do we prepare these foods? So working with amazing folks like Sean and Tanya and Elena Terry from Wild Berries and all kinds of other chefs across Turtle Island, we're working with them to mentor and to be able to encourage and empower our Indigenous seed keepers and gardeners to begin to know how to cook these foods again. I mean, that was my own history, my own sort of trajectory with seeds was like, they were sort of my grandmothers and my aunties on this really unconventional sort of rites of passage where it's like, oh, I have these seeds. Like I got these old ancestral seeds. I was like, okay, now I know how to plant them, and moving in all these directions. Like, how do I eat these? And there's like, so always this sort of choose your own adventure along that way. So yeah, it's a vitally important holistic aspect of the work we're doing. Indeed. And there's so much flavor, like the flavors, and like just one other thing I'll say, which is that, we have dozens and dozens of different corns and beans and squashes, and each one of them might have a unique recipe or preparation or way that they were traditionally used. And so having that cultural memory of the chefs and the food preparers is vital, right? Like, because otherwise we may not know exactly how these foods are prepared. So,
yeah. We have a couple of questions asking about, I think, the viability and germination of seeds that are found in places like museums. Are these seeds still alive and able to be planted? Yeah,
that's a great question. And, it's a spectrum, right? So some of those seeds, like you saw from the Field Museum, were collected in the early 1900s, right? And so even though they were likely kept in climate controlled environments. I mean, the good thing about museums is that they are climate controlled, and seeds actually have an incredible capacity to, I think, surpass our expectations of how long they can live. You know, I mean, we've all heard of like these date palms being sprouted that are like thousands of years old, or anasazi beans from caves. And if they're kept in the right conditions, they can sprout. Many of the seeds that came from the Field Museum in the initial round, the elders really wanted to sort of plant them normally, like just tuck them in the soil and plant them. And unfortunately, many of them did not sprout. But we've actually been working in the action guide. There's going to be a paper that we've written, a number of us authored a peer-reviewed paper that's all about how do we coax life from old seeds? Like, how do we work with some of these old seeds that may have really low germination rates or have been stored for a long time? There's a lot of different ways in which you can work with certain seed soaks, or certain nutrient sort of, it's like a nutrient soup that you sort of soak the seed in, that give the seed a little bit of juice. Because, you know, the way seeds work is that they have a little germ inside of them. There's like this growing point, and then they have the endosperm, which is sort of the starchy, what I call a pack lunch, right? It's like the seed's pack lunch. Like the mom sends the seed off with a pack lunch, and they're going to eat on that lunch until they can themselves plant their roots down and unfold their leaves and make food for themselves. And so again, if it's cool, dark, and dry, those seeds are eating away at that lunch a lot slower than perhaps if there's like a real volatile, warm environment. And so, but maybe that endosperm or that little starchy lunch has been depleted, but there may still be life inside of that little germ. And so there are ways, again, to sort of soaks that sort of soften the seed coat, or some nutrients that sort of serve as that sort of like, I guess, supplemental feeding that might kickstart that germ and allow those seeds to sprout. And so that's some of the things we're working on. But yeah, a lot of those seeds are old. And so there's a lot of care and tenderness that we have to take with those seeds. But, you know, even like Shelley Buffalo had said, and, you know, maybe she'll share in future opportunities at Seed Savers, is that even though those seeds came home and many of them didn't sprout, something still sprouted, which was that their desire to reconnect to these seeds and to care for them. And so in some ways, even if the seeds themselves didn't sprout, it was still a really beautiful, emotional homecoming of those seeds. And so many other things sprouted from that opportunity. So, yeah.
You say that we all have rematriation work to do. What would you say to those who don't know, for whatever reason, our own lineage or heritage?
Yeah, it's beautiful. I say start where you are. I mean, so we teach a lot of immersions and workshops through Sierra Seeds, and I oftentimes start with that, like, what is one seed that connects you to home? Or what is one seed or food that connects you to place? And lineage and ancestry is only one avenue, right? Like, many of us maybe aren't connected to our lineage or ancestry, or maybe have traumatic associations that really create a barrier between us and those ancestors. So that's when we just start where we are in place. So where do you live? What grows well there? What foods remind you of home? And begin the relationship there. Like, the rematriation to where we are can happen at any one time. And so it's just beginning to initiate a relationship with plants. And seeds are so fantastic because there's this whole life cycle that you engage with them. And there's an act of care that we engage when we begin to care for seeds. And so, you know, just beginning to say, oh, I eat a lot of this kind of food, and this kind of food makes me feel really good. What does it mean for me to establish a relationship with that particular plant and begin to grow it and care for it, and begin to become of place by connecting and nurturing that particular plant in a particular location. So we can all start from here, you know, we can just start from where we're at.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Next question. When Indigenous communities have been torn from from their seeds, has the seed keeping knowledge also been stolen? And if so, how and where is that knowledge reclaimed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's a spectrum, again, in some communities you've had seeds endure and you've had cultural memory and the knowledge of seed keeping endure. And then in some communities you've had kind of an obliteration of seeds and knowledge and all of that. And so that's, I think, the beauty of the Seed Keepers Network, is that there is this network of solidarity that's creating that cross-pollination, that there's this word called lacuna, is like if you have like a tablet, like an old like Egyptian tablet, and there's like a chunk of something missing, and so that you sort of have to intuit like what was there, like you kind of have to almost intuit like what was in that negative space. And many of us have these lacunas of knowledge, like we don't know certain ceremonies or songs or ways of seed keeping, but through connecting with other Indigenous communities, we begin to build those skills back, and we begin to build some of these ways of knowing and life ways again. And again, sometimes it pops up in odd places, like in some of these old ethnological archives. Like we've been reading, F.W. Waugh was like sitting with women who are our ancestors like 120 years ago, and we're reading these books and being like, oh, they were saying things and like they were tucked into these pages. We can rehydrate them and bring them back. And so we've been doing, that's part of ISKN's work, is mentorship, helping to empower and uplift emerging seed keepers in their skill set and begin to help them sort of remember and put the pieces back together. So
yeah, beautiful. I think we'll take time for one final question here. Are there ways for people who aren't connected to seed banks to work in allyship with Indigenous communities in this work? And I think you mentioned on your last slide some of those different connection points, so we can reiterate that in the chat here, but I'll ask the question again because I kind of interrupted myself there, but are there ways for people who aren't connected to seed banks to work in allyship with Indigenous communities in this work?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of ways. I mean, I think, in this time, I think it's relational, right? It's looking at how can we center Indigenous leadership and work, but also leverage resources and leverage privilege in whatever ways that those of you have who are non-Native, who want to be in relationship with Indigenous communities, maybe perhaps in proximity to where you live. I think that, there are countless, like for instance, at the Seed Shed, Seed Sanctuary, there was a lot of opportunity for people of all different backgrounds to come and volunteer in the gardens and to help. But I think the key is to do it in a way that doesn't sort of insert yourself in this sort of like white savior sort of way, but doing it in a way that says, I'm in service to this work and to these seeds, and want to continue to reconcile and to be able to be in right relationship with the land, with the people, upon whose land we live on, and do it in the spirit of not about centering yourself or what you can get out of it, but it's like, what can you give back? And so I think that there's lots of ways in which to do that. And again, this movement, it needs people of all kinds. Like it doesn't just need farmers and gardeners. It needs people who have access to resource. It needs policy people. It needs lawyers, advocates. It needs artists and poets. Like there's so many ways in which we can all engage in this movement to continue to create literacy of why this work is so vital and important. So yeah, that feels like a good way to end. But I'm so grateful. I know that if you are interested in learning a little bit more, I saw a question in the chat about workshop opportunities. Feel free to go check out our website, which is sierraseeds.org, where we teach. We have a Seed Save a seasonal mentorship, which is an online community, which is really vibrant and beautiful, as well as we do have some in-person workshops. And then if you go to the nativefoodalliance.org website, we host a lot of workshops that are really focused and targeted on Indigenous communities as the beneficiaries. But the workshops that we do at Sierra Seeds are intercultural, so there's people of all different backgrounds that participate. So grateful for the opportunity, and just looking forward to continue to connect with you all as we move along this path. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.